evil. It's a word that's often thrown around, but in the case of Wade Wilson, it's a concept that was embodied in the most chilling way. A man whose crimes left a trail of destruction, fear, and heartache in their wake. Today, we're diving deep into the chilling story of Wade Wilson, a man who committed unimaginable acts, including the brutal murders of 2 innocent women. This is the story of how he was eventually brought to justice, and how the system fought to protect society from one of its most dangerous individuals. It was a seasonably warm 84 degrees in Fort Myers, Florida, on the evening of October 6, 2019. Melissa Mons, a woman in her mid-30s, was out for a night of drinks, music, and fun with her boyfriend of 6 months, Wade Wilson. They had driven to the Buddha Bar in Melissa's sleek gray 2015 Dodge Hellcat, a car that would soon become central to a terrifying chain of events. Inside the bar, a heated argument erupted between Melissa and Wade. Wade was insistent on leaving to visit someone's house, a plan Melissa was firmly against. Frustrated, Wade claimed he needed to grab something from the car and went outside. Moments later, Melissa followed, only to witness her Hellcat leaving the parking lot. Wade had abandoned her, leaving her stranded without a ride. Feeling betrayed and unsure of what to do next, Melissa reached out to her friend Amy, who promptly picked her up and took her back to her place. Exhausted and emotionally drained, Melissa soon fell asleep. But by 8 a.m. the next morning, her peaceful slumber was interrupted by a barrage of phone calls from an unfamiliar number. It was Wade, furious and demanding to see her immediately. Aware of Wade's history of violence and drug use, Melissa was understandably apprehensive. She agreed to meet him, but only in a public place, her workplace. For safety, she asked Amy to accompany her. When Wade arrived, something felt off. Melissa didn't recognize the car he was driving. The vehicle was unfamiliar, and her Hellcat was nowhere in sight. As she approached Wade, she asked him about her car and her keys. But instead of providing answers, Wade's demeanor turned aggressive. He demanded that she get into the car with him. Melissa refused to get into the car, but Wade wasn't taking no for an answer. He became violent, trying to physically drag her into the vehicle. Desperate, Melissa resisted, using all her strength to prevent him from pulling her in. The situation escalated quickly, with Wade ripping at her dress, pulling her hair, and physically assaulting her. In the struggle, Wade opened the car door, forgetting to put the vehicle in park. The car started to roll forward, grazing both of their legs as Wade tackled Melissa to the ground. The assault was brutal. Melissa was slapped, punched, and choked as she fought for her life. At one point, she was dragged towards a staircase and a small crowd began to gather. But to her horror, no one stepped in to help. Eventually, Melissa managed to break free and ran to a nearby business, seeking safety. At 8:48 a.m., Fort Myers police officers arrived at the scene, responding to multiple 911 calls, reporting a man assaulting a woman. Officer Tim McCormick met Melissa at the Milo Spa, where she identified Wade Wilson as her attacker. Wade, however, had already fled the scene, prompting the police to issue an alert for his capture. At the police station, Melissa provided detailed information about her relationship with Wade. They had met through a mutual friend and had been together for 6 months. Despite learning about Wade's abusive past, Melissa had decided to give him a second chance after he was released from a 3.5-month incarceration. But Wade's criminal record was extensive, with over 20 arrests since 2010 for charges including fraud, trespassing, and physical abuse. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that the number Wade had used to contact Melissa that morning belonged to a woman named Christine Melton, someone Melissa had never heard of. Officers were dispatched to Christine's home in Cape Coral, but what they found there would turn the investigation on its head. When officers arrived at Christine Melton's home on the 4000 block of Tudor Drive, they discovered a scene that would shift the investigation from a domestic battery case to something much more sinister. Christine Melton, a 35-year-old waitress, had been found dead in her home. Her death was immediately classified as suspicious, and a homicide investigation was launched. Notably, Christine's vehicle, a black Nissan Versa, was missing. This discovery set off a frantic search for Wade Wilson and the stolen vehicle. The Fort Myers Police Department, now aware of the homicide, intensified their efforts to locate Wade, who was becoming increasingly dangerous and desperate. Soon after, Officer Tim McCormick, who had initially responded to the altercation with Melissa, received information that Wade had been spotted in the parking lot of a Joe's Crab Shack restaurant. Wade was sitting in the stolen Nissan Versa. Officer McCormick, aware of the danger, called for backup before approaching the vehicle. As Officer McCormick approached Wade, he attempted to detain him. But Wade, clearly agitated, wasn't going down without a fight. Despite Officer McCormick's attempts to calm him, Wade suddenly started the car and sped away, evading capture. A high-speed chase ensued, with Wade running stop signs and driving recklessly as he fled the scene. The chase ended when Wade managed to disappear into the streets of Cape Coral, leaving the police empty-handed. In the aftermath of the chase, Wade sought help from a man named Josh, a businessman he knew from a previous job. Desperate and on the run, Wade pleaded with Josh for money to buy a bus ticket out of town. But when Josh refused, Wade made a chilling confession. "No, you don't understand, Josh. I killed people last night." Alarmed, Josh immediately called 911, but by the time police arrived, Wade was gone. While police were frantically searching for Wade, they received yet another disturbing report. Diane Ruiz, a 43-year-old mother of two, had gone missing. She was last seen that morning, but when she failed to show up for her shift at the local Moose Lodge, her family and friends grew concerned. Her purse was found abandoned along a roadway, and a black Nissan Versa was spotted near the area where she was last seen. The disappearance of Diane Ruiz added a new layer of urgency to the manhunt. Wade Wilson, now the prime suspect in 2 murders and a disappearance, was becoming more dangerous by the hour. Later that evening, Wade made a series of phone calls to his biological father, Stephen Testa. During these calls, Wade confessed to the murders of Christine Melton and Diane Ruiz. He described in chilling detail how he had killed them. He told his father that he had met Christine at a bar, gone back to her house, and choked her to death while she slept. Unable to lift her body into the trunk of her car due to rigor mortis, Wade left her there and stole her car. He also confessed to killing Diane Ruiz. Wade explained that he had seen her walking down the street, offered her a ride, and then choked her as she sat in the passenger seat. Realizing she was still breathing after he had dumped her body, Wade ran her over with the car, describing the gruesome scene to his father in horrifying detail. Stephen Testa, who had initially wanted to help his son, was now faced with a moral dilemma. Hearing the gruesome details of Wade's crimes, he knew he had to alert the authorities. He couldn't allow his son to harm anyone else. With the critical information provided by Wade Wilson's biological father, Stephen Testa, law enforcement was finally able to track him down. Testa, despite the emotional turmoil of turning in his own son, relayed Wade's whereabouts to the authorities. Wade had been hiding in a house he had broken into while evading the police. Thanks to Testa's cooperation, the police, in coordination with the U.S. Marshals Service and the Regional Fugitive Task Force, located the residence where Wade was hiding. Upon arrival, law enforcement surrounded the home and issued loud verbal commands for Wade to surrender. After about 30 minutes, Wade opened the front door and was arrested without further incident. He was taken into custody and transported to the Cape Coral Police Department for booking before being moved to the Lee County Jail. As the investigation continued, the evidence against Wade Wilson became overwhelming. Forensic analysis confirmed his involvement in the murders of Christine Milton and Diane Ruiz. The stolen Nissan Versa, which Wade had taken, was found with traces of blood that matched both women, and Wade's DNA was discovered at both crime scenes. In the months leading up to the trial, as the years passed, Wade underwent a significant transformation while awaiting trial. During his time in custody, he added numerous facial tattoos, including several that were deeply disturbing, such as Nazi symbols. This alarming change in his appearance became a point of concern for his defense team. They requested the court's permission to use facial makeup to cover the tattoos, arguing that these symbols could prejudice the jury against Wade. Although the court granted this request, the defense ultimately decided against using the makeup during the trial. Wade's tattoos, visible throughout the proceedings, added to the tension and gravity of the case. When the trial finally commenced on June 10, 2024, after several years of delays, the prosecution presented a strong case. Multiple witnesses came forward to testify that Wade had confessed to the murders, and despite the defense's attempts to argue for diminished responsibility, the evidence against Wade was overwhelming. With Wade Wilson in custody, the prosecution began building their case against him. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA eyewitness testimony, the confessions to his father, and the chilling details of his crimes. The prosecution's goal was to ensure that Wade Wilson could never harm anyone again, seeking the harshest penalties available under the law. Wade's defense team, on the other hand, had a daunting task. With such damning evidence, their strategy focused on mitigating the potential sentences rather than outright acquittal. They aimed to challenge the validity of Wade's confessions, arguing that they were made under duress or in a state of mental instability. They also sought to portray Wade as a troubled individual with a history of mental illness and substance abuse, hoping to sway the jury towards a more lenient sentence. In early 2020, the trial of Wade Wilson began. It was a high-profile case with intense media coverage and a community eager for justice. The prosecution wasted no time in presenting their case, starting with the harrowing testimony of Melissa Mons, who recounted her terrifying encounter with Wade on the morning of October 7, 2019. Her testimony painted a picture of a man who was violent, unpredictable, and capable of extreme brutality. The prosecution also presented the physical evidence, including the DNA samples found at the crime scenes, the bloodstains in the stolen car, and the forensic analysis that linked Wade to both murders. The jury was shown photos of the crime scenes, the injuries sustained by the victims, and the timeline of events that led to their deaths. Perhaps the most damning piece of evidence was the recorded phone call between Wade and his father, Stephen Testa. The jury listened as Wade calmly and without remorse described how he had killed Christine Melton and Diane Ruiz. It was a moment that left the courtroom in stunned silence. When it was the defense's turn, they attempted to humanize Wade, presenting him as a man who had been failed by society and struggled with severe mental health issues. They called on experts to testify about Wade's history of substance abuse, his difficult childhood, and his long battle with mental illness. The defense argued that these factors contributed to his violent behavior and should be considered when deciding his fate. They also challenged the credibility of the confession recordings, suggesting that Wade was not in a sound state of mind when he made them. The defense claimed that Wade was under the influence of drugs and alcohol during the calls, and that his confessions were the ramblings of a man in a delusional state, not a clear admission of guilt. However, the prosecution countered these arguments by pointing out Wade's calculated actions, such as fleeing from the police and attempting to cover his tracks, which demonstrated a clear awareness of his crimes and their consequences. After weeks of testimony, the trial came to a close. In their final statements, the prosecution emphasized the brutality of Wade's actions and the devastating impact they had on the families of Christine Melton and Diane Ruiz. They argued that Wade Wilson was a dangerous individual who posed a serious threat to society and deserved the maximum penalty under the law. The defense, in their closing arguments, once again urged the jury to consider Wade's troubled background and mental health struggles. They asked for mercy, suggesting that a life sentence without parole would be a more appropriate punishment than the death penalty. The jury deliberated for several hours before returning with their verdict. Wade Wilson was found guilty of all charges, including 2 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and aggravated battery. The next phase of the trial would determine his sentence. The sentencing phase of the trial was equally intense. The prosecution sought the death penalty, arguing that Wade's crimes were premeditated, heinous, and deserving of the ultimate punishment. They called on the families of Christine Melton and Diane Ruiz to provide victim impact statements, which were heart-wrenching and emotional. The families spoke of the pain and loss they had endured, the void left by the deaths of their loved ones, and their desire for justice. The defense, on the other hand, pleaded for a life sentence. They reiterated Wade's mental health issues and the potential for rehabilitation, although the likelihood of such an outcome was slim. The defense argued that executing Wade would not bring back the victims, and that a life sentence would allow him to reflect on his actions for the rest of his days. After careful consideration, the jury recommended a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The judge agreed with the jury's recommendation and formally sentenced Wade Wilson to life in prison. Following Wade Wilson's sentencing, the families of the victims expressed a mixture of relief and sorrow. They were relieved that Wade would never be able to harm anyone else, but the pain of losing their loved ones remained ever present. The community of Fort Myers, which had been shaken by the brutal murders, also found some solace in the outcome, knowing that justice had been served. In the years following the trial, Wade Wilson has remained incarcerated, serving his life sentence without the possibility of parole. His case has become a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked violence and the importance of mental health intervention. While the legal chapter of Wade Wilson's story has come to an end, the impact of his actions continues to be felt by those who knew and loved Christine Melton and Diane Ruiz. Thank you for watching, and remember to stay safe, take care of your mental health, and look out for one another. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more true crime stories.